There is a moment on live television when the cameras keep rolling but everyone in the control room stops breathing. Not because something has gone wrong with the equipment. Not because a guest has said something they should not have said. But because two people who have sat at the same table for years, who have built a professional relationship out of thousands of hours of recorded conversation, suddenly stop performing that relationship and start having a real one, in front of millions of people, with no script and no way to take it back. That is what happened on a Friday morning when Sunny Hostin looked across the table at Joy Behar and said something that ended the conversation before it had really begun. 5 words. Maybe 6. Delivered without raising her voice, without leaning forward, without any of the theatrical signals that usually accompany confrontation on television. She simply said what she had clearly been thinking for a while, and the studio that had been buzzing with the ordinary noise of a live audience went still in a way that audiences only go still when they understand, instinctively, that they are watching something that was not supposed to happen this way. Joy Behar, who has spent more than 3 decades learning how to read a room and control a conversation, did not have a response ready. And that absence, that visible gap where a comeback should have been, told the audience everything they needed to know about what had just occurred. This is the story of that moment. Not just the line itself, but everything underneath it. The years of history between two women who respect each other and also, clearly, have accumulated frustrations that do not always make it onto camera. The specific issue that finally cracked the surface. And what it reveals about what happens when professional composure runs up against something that has been building for longer than anyone watching at home could have guessed. To understand why this moment carried the weight it carried, you have to understand who Sunny Hostin actually is, underneath the recognizable face that appears at that table every morning. She is not, by training or temperament, a person who raises her voice to win an argument. She spent years as a federal prosecutor before she ever sat behind a television desk, and that background shapes everything about how she operates in a debate. Prosecutors do not yell. Yelling is what you do when you do not have the facts, when you are hoping volume will substitute for substance. Prosecutors build a case. They establish a sequence. They let the evidence accumulate, piece by piece, until the conclusion becomes obvious to anyone paying attention, and then they deliver the closing statement that ties it all together. That is the skill Sunny Hostin brought to a daytime talk show, and it is a skill that does not always translate well to the rhythms of morning television, where the conversation is supposed to move quickly, where reactions are supposed to be immediate and visible and emotionally legible to a studio audience that wants something to applaud or gasp at. Sunny Hostin has spent years adapting that prosecutorial patience to a format that often rewards the opposite instinct. And most of the time, it works because the table needs both kinds of energy. It needs Joy Behar's immediacy, her willingness to say the unfiltered thing the moment it occurs to her, and it needs Sunny Hostin's deliberateness, her insistence on getting the details right before she commits to a position. Those two approaches have coexisted at that table for years, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in a friction that produces some of the show's most memorable segments. But friction that stays productive for years can, under the right circumstances, finally become something else. And on this particular Friday, it did. The subject that morning was not, on its surface, the kind of topic that should have produced a moment like this. It was a story making the rounds about a public figure who had made comments that touched on race, opportunity, and the question of who actually earns success in America versus who has it handed to them. It is the kind of segment The View covers regularly, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes in a way that generates more heat than light, depending on which co-hosts are leading the discussion and how the morning's news cycle has primed everyone's emotional state before they even sat down. Joy Behar opened with her characteristic directness. She offered her take quickly, the way she almost always does, framing the controversy in terms that reflected her own decades of watching American culture shift and circle back on itself. She has seen versions of this argument before, she has made versions of this argument before, and she delivered her opinion with the confidence of someone who believes the pattern is familiar enough that the conclusion should be obvious. The audience responded the way audiences usually respond to Joy Behar's opening volleys, with a mixture of applause and a few audible murmurs of agreement scattered through the room. And then Sunny Hostin began to speak, and it became clear almost immediately that she was not going to simply nod along or offer a complimentary perspective. She started, as she often does, with a fact. a specific detail from the story that Joy had either left out or had not fully absorbed before forming her opinion. It was a small correction at first, delivered in the measured tone Sunny Hostin uses when she is laying the first brick of an argument rather than throwing a punch. Joy responded the way she typically responds to a correction mid-sentence, by acknowledging it quickly and then continuing to build toward her original point, treating the detail as a footnote rather than something that should reshape her conclusion. This is a pattern that has played out at that table many times before. Someone offers a fact, the original speaker absorbs it without fully recalibrating, and the conversation moves forward with both perspectives still technically on the table, unreconciled but coexisting. Usually that is exactly how the segment proceeds, a layered conversation where multiple viewpoints sit side by side without anyone declaring a winner. But this time, Sunny Hostin did not let the correction become a footnote. She circled back to it. She said the detail mattered. Not as an aside, not as a minor point of accuracy, but as something that fundamentally changed the framing Joy had built her entire argument around. And she said it with a directness that was unusual even for her, a directness that signaled she had decided, in that moment, that this particular issue was not going to be allowed to pass by unaddressed the way so many small disagreements at that table typically do. The studio audience, attuned after years of watching this show to the subtle shifts in energy between the co-hosts, picked up on the change immediately. There is a specific quality to the silence that falls over a live audience when they sense that what they are watching has stopped being a performed disagreement and has become something with real stakes attached to it. That silence settled over the room as Sunny Hostin continued, laying out, point by point, why the framing Joy had used was not just incomplete but, in her assessment, actively misleading about what the story actually represented. Joy Behar, to her credit, did not retreat immediately. She has never been someone who backs down simply because the room has gotten tense, and she pushed back, restating her position with slightly more emphasis, slightly more volume, the way she often does when she feels a point is being misunderstood rather than genuinely contested. She has built her entire career on trusting her own instincts in these moments, on believing that her read of a situation, however quickly formed, usually holds up under scrutiny because she has been doing this long enough to have developed a reliable sense for where these conversations are supposed to land. For 3 decades, that instinct has served her extraordinarily well. It has made her one of the most enduring and beloved voices in daytime television, a woman whose opinions carry weight precisely because audiences trust that they come from somewhere real rather than from careful political calculation. But Sunny Hostin was not contesting the sincerity of Joy's instinct. She was contesting its accuracy. And that is a different kind of disagreement, one that does not resolve simply by both parties restating their positions with increasing conviction. Sunny Hostin pressed further. She brought in a second piece of context, then a third, building the structure of her argument the way she once built cases in a courtroom, methodically, so that by the time she arrived at her actual conclusion, the path leading there had already been laid out clearly enough that the conclusion felt less like an opinion and more like the only reasonable place the facts could lead. This is the moment in the segment where the energy in the room shifted from tense to genuinely charged. Because everyone watching, in the studio and at home, could sense that Sunny Hostin was not simply offering a counterpoint anymore. She was building toward something, and the audience could feel the momentum gathering the way you feel weather changing before the first drop of rain actually falls. Whoopi Goldberg, sensing where the conversation was headed, attempted the kind of gentle redirect that has become her specialty over the years she has served as the show's moderator. She offered a transitional comment, something designed to acknowledge both positions and ease the table toward the next point on the rundown without forcing either woman to fully concede anything. It is a skill Whoopi has refined over countless episodes, the ability to lower the temperature without making either party feel dismissed. But this time, the redirect did not take. Sunny Hostin, normally someone who respects the rhythm of the show and follows Whoopi's lead when she signals it is time to move on, did not move on. She said she wanted to finish the point. And there was something in the way she said it, a quiet but unmistakable firmness, that told everyone at the table this was not a moment where she was going to defer to the usual choreography of the show. She turned back to Joy Behar directly, and she delivered the line that would become the moment everyone remembered from that episode. She said it without raising her voice, without theatrical flourish, without any of the comedic timing Joy herself might have used to soften a similarly pointed comment. she simply said, with the flat, certain clarity of someone who has finished assembling her case and is now delivering the verdict, that Joy was not actually disagreeing with the facts, she was disagreeing with having to sit with something uncomfortable, and that those were not the same thing, and that she was not going to pretend they were the same thing just to keep the segment moving smoothly. For a moment, nobody at the table said anything. Sarah Haynes, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, glanced down at her notes in the specific way people glance at notes when they are trying to give themselves a beat before deciding whether to step into a conversation that has suddenly become more serious than the rundown anticipated. Alyssa Farah Griffin shifted slightly in her seat, the kind of small physical adjustment that happens when someone senses the temperature in a room has changed and their body responds before their mind has fully processed why. Anna Navarro's expression did something complicated, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even agreement, mixed with the visible awareness that this was Joy and Sunny's moment to navigate, not anyone else's to step into prematurely. And Joy Behar, the woman who has spent 30 years never being at a loss for a comeback, sat with it. She did not immediately fire back. She did not deploy the practiced deflection that has served her in countless similar moments over the decades, the joke that diffuses tension, the pivot that redirects attention, the warmth that reminds everyone watching that whatever just happened, the affection underneath it is still real. None of those tools appeared in that moment, at least not immediately. She simply looked at Sunny Hostin, and something passed across her face that the cameras caught and that would later be replayed, frame by frame, by people trying to understand exactly what that expression meant. Surprise, certainly. Perhaps something closer to being genuinely seen in a way she had not anticipated being seen, on a Friday morning, in front of an audience that had shown up expecting the usual rhythm of the show and instead found themselves witnessing something that felt, for just a few seconds, unrehearsed in the truest sense of the word. The audience did not applaud immediately. This is important because audiences at The View are conditioned, after years of regular tapings, to respond quickly to moments of confrontation, to provide the encouraging noise that signals to the co-hosts that the audience is engaged and invested in whatever dynamic is playing out at the table. But in the seconds immediately following Sunny Hostin's comment, the studio remained quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, not the kind of silence that signals an audience has turned against someone, but a quiet that comes from genuine uncertainty about what they had just witnessed and whether it was the kind of moment that called for applause or for something more like respectful stillness. It was Sunny Hostin's own quality of delivery, the lack of theatricality, the absence of any obvious cue that this was meant to be a crowd-pleasing comment, that left the room genuinely unsure how to respond in real time. Joy Behar eventually spoke again. And what she said in that moment revealed something about her own character that her critics, who sometimes characterize her as simply combative or quick-tempered, consistently underestimate. She did not double down. She did not insist that Sunny had mischaracterized her position. Instead, she said, slowly, that she needed to think about that. For words. Delivered without performance, without the comedic timing that usually accompanies even her most serious moments at that table. She needed to think about it. For a woman who has built an entire public identity around having an immediate, confident, fully formed opinion on virtually everything, that admission, that visible willingness to sit with the discomfort Sunny had just named rather than immediately rejecting it, was its own kind of revelation. Whoopi Goldberg, sensing that the moment had reached a natural point of resolution, even if not a comfortable one, gently moved the conversation toward a break. The audience applauded then, not because the tension had been resolved into something tidy and triumphant, but because they recognized that they had just watched two women they respect navigate something difficult with more honesty than the format of daytime television usually allows for. That applause was not celebration in the traditional sense. It was something closer to acknowledgement, the kind of recognition an audience offers when they understand they have witnessed something real rather than performed. What happened during the commercial break has been described by people who were in the studio that day, though never confirmed in any official capacity by either woman publicly. The account suggests that Sunny Hostin, away from the cameras, approached Joy Behar directly. That the two of them spoke quietly, away from the rest of the table, for the better part of the break. That whatever was said in that conversation was not performed for anyone, was not designed to be repeated or clipped or shared, but was simply two colleagues working through something that had surfaced in front of an audience but needed to be resolved in private. This is, in many ways, the part of the story that matters more than the viral moment itself. Because the moment that gets clipped and shared and discussed online is always the confrontation. It is rarely the repair that happens afterward, away from the cameras, in the unglamorous work of two professional adults figuring out how to continue working together after one of them has said something true and uncomfortable to the other in front of millions of people. When the show returned from break, something had visibly shifted at the table. Not in a way that suggested either woman had abandoned her position, but in a way that suggested the air had cleared somewhat, that whatever tension had built during the segment had been at least partially metabolized during those few minutes away from the cameras. Joy Behar made a small joke, something self-deprecating, the kind of comment she often uses to signal that she is ready to move forward without pretending the previous moment had not happened. Sunny Hostin responded with something warmer than the directness she had shown minutes earlier, a small gesture that suggested she had said what she needed to say and was not interested in extending the confrontation any further than it needed to go. The rest of the show proceeded largely as planned, but anyone who had been watching closely understood that something had genuinely happened in that earlier segment, something that would not simply disappear once the cameras moved on to lighter material. In the days that followed, the clip circulated widely. Commentators across the political spectrum offered their interpretations, many of them reading into the moment whatever confirmed their existing opinions about either woman, about the show itself, about the broader cultural debates the original segment had touched on. Some framed it as Sunny Hostin finally saying what many viewers had apparently wanted someone to say to Joy Behar for years. Others framed it as an uncomfortable display of tension within a friendship that had always been more complicated than the easy camaraderie the show usually presents. Neither framing fully captured what people who were actually in that studio described feeling, which was something closer to the specific discomfort and respect that comes from watching two people who care about getting things right have a real disagreement in a format that usually does not allow for that kind of rawness to survive past the commercial break. What makes this moment worth examining closely, beyond the simple mechanics of who said what to whom, is what it reveals about the particular pressures of doing this kind of show for as long as these women have done it. Joy Behar has been sitting at that table, in one form or another, for the better part of 3 decades. Sunny Hostin has been there for more than a decade herself, building a reputation as the legal mind of the panel, the person whose opinions are expected to be grounded in something more rigorous than instinct. Both women have, over the years, developed public personas that audiences expect and rely on, personas that are not entirely false but are also not the complete picture of who either of them actually is when the cameras are not specifically engineered to capture spontaneity. The moment between them that Friday morning was notable precisely because it broke, even briefly, from those established personas. Joy was not performing her usual confident immediacy. Sunny was not performing the careful diplomatic correction she usually offers when she disagrees with a colleague. For a few seconds, two professional broadcasters who have spent years learning how to manage a live audience's expectation simply forgot, or perhaps chose to set aside, the management, and said something true to each other instead. This is, in the end, what makes television like this matter, on the rare occasions when it actually delivers a moment like this one. Not the confrontation itself, which by the standards of actual conflict in the world is almost nothing, two colleagues disagreeing firmly during a segment about a news story. But the rarity of watching two people who have every professional incentive to keep things smooth, who have built careers partially on their ability to maintain a certain kind of on-camera composure, choose instead, even briefly, to let something real surface. Sunny Hostin shut the conversation down that morning not because she wanted to win an argument, but because she had reached a point where pretending the disagreement was smaller than it actually was had stopped feeling honest to her. And Joy Behar, in her response, in that uncharacteristic willingness to sit with discomfort rather than immediately deflect it, showed an audience something about herself that 30 years of practiced confidence had not fully revealed before. The two women continued working together in the weeks and months that followed, the way colleagues who respect each other generally do after a moment of real friction. There was no public falling out, no dramatic resignation, no sustained coldness between them on subsequent episodes. If anything, people who watched the show closely noted that the dynamic between Joy and Sunny seemed, in the aftermath, slightly more careful in a good way, more attentive, as though both women had taken something from that exchange about how much weight their words actually carried with each other, beyond the performance of disagreement that the format of the show sometimes encourages. What nobody expected, going into that Friday morning, was that an ordinary segment about an ordinary news story would produce a moment that people would still be discussing weeks later, would still be replaying, would still be trying to decode for what it revealed about two women who have spent years allowing audiences to believe they understood the full shape of who they are. Sunny Hostin shut Joy Behar down that day, not with volume, not with theatrics, but with the simple, devastating clarity of someone who had finally decided that a particular kind of avoidance was not something she was willing to participate in any longer. And in the silence that followed, in the 4 quiet words Joy Behar offered in response, an audience that thought it had seen everything this show could offer discovered that even after 30 years, there were still moments capable of surprising them.